All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin our presentation, and we will begin by stating the following. It is the evening of March 28, 1865. Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant is at his headquarters at City Point, Virginia. Nearby, the Army of the Potomac is besieging Petersburg. After a long winter of stalemate, the general anticipates the beginning of the spring campaign. Just that morning, President Lincoln, General William Tecumseh Sherman, and Admiral David Dixon Porter met aboard the Navy steamer, the River Queen, for a high-level conference where they discussed the military situation and the president's plans for reconstruction. After a long day, General Grant relaxes by his cabin and reflects. He is joined there by George Alfred Townsend, a correspondent of the New York World. I hope everyone enjoys the General's presentation, and without further ado, General Grant, are you with us?
It is quiet here. Has your staff retired for the night?
I believe they have.
Been buzzing like a hive around here the last few days. General Rollins is saying that there's been some concern that General Lee may attempt to break the siege any day now.
Well, he has few choices. His men are subsisting on but little, nearly starving. His army is hemorrhaging from desertions. He stays. He must surrender.
Now, you do expect that General Lee will attempt the junction of his forces with General Johnston's army?
Yes, well, the attack at Fort Stedman a few days back was an effort to disrupt our lines in preparation for some kind of breakout attempt somewhere west. His failure was very costly to him, and men lost. Now he's going to have to move soon.
Now, if Lee abandons his position, would he still be able to defend Richmond?
No, he's too weak.
Well, if he's too weak, I suppose the Confederacy may be on its last legs.
Perhaps.
I understand General Sherman has returned to his command in North Carolina.
Yes, he left aboard the Bat this afternoon.
Well, his visit and President Lincoln's, of course, has certainly been the talk of camp. Had it not been over a year since you had last seen the general?
Yes. Well, it seems like longer. I think the last time I saw Sherman was in Cincinnati.
Sherman is an interesting man. I have followed his career with interest since early in the war, back when the papers were saying Sherman was insane.
Mm.
And now Sherman is a national hero. I guess he proved those rumors to be false.
Yes, well, those rumors were most scandalous and harmful to Sherman and his family. And all too convenient for army rivals.
Well, it was a terrible episode. I had the pleasure of meeting the general briefly on the wharf shortly after he arrived. It occurs to me now that his manner could easily be misconstrued. He is an intense man, somewhat nervous, quite energetic, and he talks nonstop.
Yes. Yes, that's Sherman, all right. I think he puts people off because he always speaks the truth. That's what got him in trouble early in the war.
Oh,
Well, Sherman was something of a prophet of doom in those days, you understand. Nobody wanted to hear it when Sherman predicted the number of soldiers it would take to put down the rebellion or the cost in human life. I think they took him more seriously after Shiloh, though.
well, from the accounts of Shiloh I read, it sounded like a savage contest.
Oh, it was. It's probably the severest battle fought in the West. Certainly the most misunderstood.
The most misunderstood. Why do you think that is, General?
Well, frankly, your colleagues had much to do with that. There are but few correspondents at Vicksburg Landing during the battle. No, they all arrived after the guns had cooled. Their reports were filled with rumors and speculation and reckless suppositions. And then those reports carried in all the northern papers and created a very erroneous notion of the battle and my role.
Yes, I can see that. Although I recall General Sherman defended you most handsomely.
Well, Sherman has always been most steadfast and true. He defended me against many scurrilous charges, including that I was drunk on duty. And then on the campaign to Corinth, after Halleck had come down and assumed command, it was Sherman that convinced me to stay with the army when I was about to take my leave of it.
General, do you mean to say you had aimed to resign?
I did. I requested Halleck to relieve me several times, in fact. My position was most embarrassing. I was second in command. I had no command of troops, whatever. Superfluous. But Sherman convinced me to stay. He argued that some happy accident would come about that would restore me to a place of honor. I heeded his advice, and he turned out to be right, of course.
Well, I am glad you heeded his advice. Sherman does not seem to be the kind of man to withhold his opinion. He strikes me as frank and forthright.
That he is. If he thinks I'm in error, he will be quick to tell me so. But in fairness, he's just. He will also admit when he's erred. I recall this moment when we were investing Vicksburg. Sherman and I were standing on Haynes Bluff, staring down at the Chickasaw Bayou region. Standing there, he reminded me of his earlier advice to abandon the whole campaign. He had argued earlier that we should pull back to Memphis, start from scratch. Standing there in that moment, he admitted he was wrong. This is a campaign, he said. This is a success if we never take the town.
What you did, and history will never forget it. Although, I have heard it said that the capture of Vicksburg followed an especially long and difficult campaign.
Well, I should think we summed it up. Oh, that campaign was something of a nightmare, at least at the start. The topography in the river conspired to protect that city, I'll tell you. And that river, Mississippi, it might rise or fall a dozen feet or more on whim. After a number of failed experiments, I finally determined that if we were to have success, we were going to have to march the troops down the Louisiana shore, cross them over, and come at Vicksburg from the south. That meant the Navy would have to run the Vicksburg batteries, most hazardous undertaking, in order to provide transports to get the troops across the river. Thankfully, Admiral Porter was a ready partner, most unwavering in his support. And they were largely successful. We were able to cross the troops from Louisiana shore. Boy, that was rough country there. Land seemed to stand on edge. Deep ravines choked with timber and vine. Made lateral communication between Army segments almost impossible. We marched rapidly on Jackson, antecedent to an attempt on Vicksburg itself. Once we captured that place, we turned to find General Pemberton in our rear, prepared to contest our move against Vicksburg. That led to a couple of pitched battles. Champion Hill, Big Black River. Pemberton took heavy losses before finally retreating under the guns of the city. I was most anxious to avoid a siege. So we launched a series of heavy assaults, which failed bloodily. So finally, we took stock, undertook a detailed examination of the ground, which amounted to a giant puzzle. Finally, carefully laid our approaches and invested the city.
Well, and the fall of Vicksburg meant you had captured yet another rebel army, as you had at Fort Donelson the year prior. Unconditional surrender Grant, they called you in the papers. Although I recall that some were disgruntled that you had paroled the garrison instead of taking them prisoner.
Yes, well, there was much grumbling among the armchair warriors, to be sure. But look, I had to deal with the situation as I found it. First of all, the Navy was most reluctant to remove 30,000 prisoners upriver. That would have tied up the Navy for months. And then two, we just did not have the POW camps to hold that many. Oh, I know, Halleck and others. They said that those soldiers would not await proper exchange and be right back in the ranks. But that presupposes that the men were in any condition to be soldiers again. Most were not, owing to malnutrition, or that they would be willing to go back into the ranks. No. Desertions had taken a great toll on Pemberton's army, both before and after the surrender. I am certain that most of those men never again shouldered the musket.
Well, broken and dispirited men do not make an effective fighting force. That is true. Was that not the state of affairs among our men when you arrived in Chattanooga in the fall of '63?
Well, yeah, though maybe not to the same extent. Those troops were dispirited by their defeat at Chickamauga. They were frustrated that their commander pulled them back to Chattanooga and sat there, allowing the Confederates to essentially take them under siege. That led to meager rations. And men who are wanting food do not make good companions or soldiers.
But you and General Sherman remedied the problem and soundly defeated General Bragg's army.
Just like that. Made it sound easy.
Well, Bragg's force was bearing down at the town from great heights with his guns trained on it. No, I suppose breaking his line would not have been easy.
No. But now that I think on it, General Thomas's army certainly made it look easy as they stormed over Missionary Ridge. And
General Sherman was also instrumental to that victory, was he not?
Yes, he and General Hooker. Hooker had taken Lookout Mountain and then fought from the south end of Missionary Ridge. Sherman was up on the north side working his way from Tunnel Hill. It was his fighting that caused Bragg to thin the center of his line, allowed Thomas to break him.
Victory follows you everywhere, General. Oh, I also recall reading that General Sherman had subsequently relieved the siege of Knoxville.
Yes. Though the situation there wasn't quite as General Burnside had made it out to be. That general had been making the most urgent appeals to Washington, claiming that General Longstreet had taken him under siege and his army was starving. Lincoln and Stanton joined the chorus, repeatedly urged me to go to his relief. Well, once Bragg took flight into Georgia, I dispatched Sherman. He was most unhappy with this assignment. His army was pretty blown. But they made the march. Sherman arrived to find that Longstreet had taken to the mountains, that Knoxville had never been fully under siege, and then arrived to discover General Burnside and his staff dining on a sumptuous banquet, his army adequately provisioned.
General Sherman must have been astonished.
Yes, he was. I am certain that general will never forget the tongue lashing Sherman gave him for his exaggerations.
Oh, well, from what I know of General Sherman, I am certain he can deliver a memorable admonishment.
Yes, he certainly can.
Hmm. I think General Sherman's capture of Atlanta was nearly as important to the Union cause as the surrender of Vicksburg. General, what do you think it is that makes General Sherman so successful?
Well, he's certainly a master of logistics. Plans meticulously, leaves nothing to chance. In the case of Georgia, Sherman knew that ground better than Johnston, having spent a lot of time there in the old army. This was a decisive advantage in that campaign.
Oh, it would be.
The topography of North Georgia, really rough, very mountainous. Moving an army through it is a nightmare. And then Sherman had but a single rail line running down to Atlanta with which to feed his army. Keeping that in operation was a real chore.
Oh. Yes, I suppose a break of the railroad line for a sustained period would mean great want among the soldiers and could jeopardize the campaign.
Too true. You know, in the days before that campaign, Sherman recruited and trained a number of rail repair gangs and then stationed them at strategic points along the line to move at a moment's notice. This strategy paid off in spades. Just another example of Sherman's great foresight.
I have also heard it said that General Thomas, General Logan, and others considered Jefferson Davis's removal of General Johnston from command of the Confederate Army in front of Atlanta and the subsequent appointment of General Hood to be a great favor for the Union cause.
Well, that may be. Joe Johnston certainly had the respect of men north and south in the old army, I'll tell you. And he was a particularly skilled engineer. Hood might be a tenacious fighter, but he can be bold to the point of recklessness. I know Sherman doesn't hold a great opinion of his abilities.
I also recall that General McPherson was killed in the fighting around Atlanta.
Yes. He was shot off his horse. Terrible loss.
I met McPherson in Washington once by chance. He was a most genial fellow.
That he was. You know, not long before his death, he was engaged to be married. Sherman tells me that he intended to perfect the arrangement on his next leave.
Oh, that is sad. Now, General, I understand that when General Sherman proposed the march to the sea, that you had trepidations.
That's true. I was concerned about his turning his back on Hood's army for the ultimate safety of Nashville. It was an unorthodox campaign that he was suggesting, after all. There was no army in his path, no strategic military asset to gain. It aimed at Confederate morale, pure and simple. Sherman is a deep man. He has a good understanding of human nature. On that campaign to Savannah, he put fear in the hearts of the rebels. And when he turned north into the Carolinas, the citizens quaked at the thought of Sherman and his terrible men visiting their homes. Sherman recently called this a power. He used their anxieties against him. It worked marvelously.
Well, General Sherman has certainly cultivated a fearsome reputation for himself and his men. The March to the Sea will be remembered as one of the great campaigns in the history of warfare, despite the lack of large-scale battles. And General Thomas virtually destroyed Hood's army in front of Nashville.
Yes, well, the march should place Sherman in the company of history's great commanders. As for Thomas, he gave me many anxious moments, but he did the job upright in the end.
Now, I suppose General Sherman's return to North Carolina is a precursor to a renewed campaign against General Johnston. It seems likely that he will move to join General Lee. Does this cause you concern?
Not at all. I trust Sherman will interpose between them.
But should they combine forces? Do you think you can defeat both Lee and Johnston?
Yes, but it won't come to that. General Sheridan is also on guard, and I trust he will interpose between them. Oh dear, Mr. Townsend, it seems that you have broken your pencil.
No matter. I have others.
Of course.
No. General Sheridan does good work. Cadwalader tells me he is all business and very passionate.
That he is.
Now, I understand that you, General Sherman, Admiral Porter, and Admiral Porter met with the president today.
Yeah.
A council of war.
Not exactly. The president wished to be apprised of the situation.
And did he wish to be briefed of your plans for the coming campaign?
No, the president rarely inquires of my military operations.
Let's see. So you gave the president a complete assessment of the situation as it stands and perhaps an outlook for the future.
I guess, but in point of fact, Sherman did most of the talking, as usual.
Yes, yes, that seems right. The president has a lot of faith in you, General.
That may be so.
But do you have faith in him?
Now that is impertinent, Mr. Townsend.
My apologies, General. But there are many in Washington, some in Congress, who believe the president is unsuited to his position. A simpleton, they say, who is out of his depth.
Well, they're entitled to their opinions, I suppose, but I disagree with them. The president is a wise and a modest man. He knows when to talk, when to keep silent. He knows when to listen to the experts and when to trust his own judgment. The president hired me to do a job and keeps out of my way.
He does seem to be a humble man. There is also a melancholy air about him.
Well, it has been a long, difficult war. The president feels very deeply the cost of this war in human life. Keeps him awake at night. He asked me just this morning if we could end this war without further bloodshed. Well, that wasn't up to us. The rebels could, if they wished, end this war at any time, but just laying down their arms. If the war does continue and there is more blood spilled, it's entirely due to their desire to prolong the contest.
Might the war end in a negotiated settlement instead of on the battlefield?
No. No, there's been many attempts over the past year or so to come to some kind of truce or understanding, but the rebels will not negotiate on any basis that does not allow them to keep their slaves or to attain their independence.
What does it take to convince Jefferson Davis that the war is lost? It has been apparent to me for some time now that the Confederacy does not have the capacity to sustain the war. They have no more manpower to draw to their armies. They do not have food enough to nourish their soldiers. Inflation has decimated the Southern economy. No, I do not understand why they continue the fight.
Well, there's a good question, young man. I'm afraid I don't have the answers. Suppose it's a matter of honor. That is a hard thing to satisfy.
They say General Lee is a man with a strong sense of honor, perhaps misplaced. General, would you say that General Lee has been your most skilled adversary?
Well, he's certainly a good military commander, but human nonetheless. This is a point I had to take up with the Army of the Potomac when I first came east. I can't tell you how many times I heard, "Yes, General, but you've never faced Bobby Lee. they seemed to think that he had supernatural abilities or something. You know, Sherman talks of this power that he has over the civilians in North Carolina and beyond. But Lee long held the power over the minds of the soldiers and some officers in the Army of the Potomac. This was a notion I had to dispel if we were going to attain success.
Did you know General Lee in the old army?
Well, we met. We were both on Scott's expedition. Lee was on Scott's staff. It's a fine army. I recall Lee did some incredible reconnaissance work, helped to find a way around the enemy flank. Not long after, I remember Scott said that Lee was America's finest soldier.
It is too bad he chose to betray his country.
Yes. Well, I do admire his zeal, devotion to a cause. Though I have to say, it's the worst cause I believe a man has ever fought for.
Oh, I heartily agree. A rebellion fomented to protect and maintain the institution of human bondage is an atrocity. No, the defeat of the Confederacy means the end of slavery on this continent forever. Now, General Grant, do you expect to accept General Lee's sword by Easter?
I can't say. So, Lee does not move soon. I might have to force the issue.
You mean to break the siege yourself?
Perhaps.
I expect, General, that you and General Lee will be reacquainted soon.
Well, for the good of the country, let's hope it's very soon. Good night, Mr. Townsend.
Good night, General. May Providence bring you victory.
Folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did with General Grant and our war correspondent. They are now available to answer questions from the audience. So, who has a question for General Grant or for the newspaper person? Yes, Dan.
So the newspaper person, was that actually a source that you interviewed him that day at that time?
No, so whenever you dramatize something, you have to take a little bit of license. We do know that Townsend was in camp that day. There was a lot of buzz over the River Queen conference, you understand. So it is quite possible that the two ran into each other.
Other question? Yes, Dan.
General Grant, it's 1865. My friends say I have a rather uncanny ability to predict the future, and I predict your Vicksburg campaign will be studied as one of a campaign of maneuver and faith, much a very Napoleonic campaign. And when you move east to Virginia, it's a much different kind of campaign. I predict there will be a popular sport called football where the term smash mouth will become common. And Virginia is much more of a smash mouth campaign. Would you mind commenting on the differences between the two?
Well, I think that's true, though, you know, topography plays a role in the difference, right? I think that the Western theater was much more rugged and posed more physical barriers, perhaps, which is not to discount the big rivers of Virginia, right, that were a concern. I do think that that your observations are correct. I do think it is much more hard knocks or smash mouth, as you might say. I mean, there's something to the fact that Lee is a talented man, right? The most talented, perhaps, that the Confederacy offered. And he knew the land there really well in Virginia, right? And so he knew just how to block Grant's every move. I'm not sure if Lee anticipated just how tenacious Grant would be, though, and not, you know, giving up when he met defeat. I mean, let's face it, over the course of the 6 weeks of the Overland Campaign, you know, what victory can Grant really claim in that, right? Except that he keeps getting around Lee, regardless of the obstacles and regardless of the casualties, right? And I think it's like 60,000 casualties that the Army of the Potomac suffers by the time that they besiege Petersburg, right? I think that, you know, what you're saying is appropriate. Yeah.
Personally, I think once Grant crosses the river in
The James River.
no, I'm sorry, in Vicksburg, once he crosses the Mississippi, terrain is pretty darn wide open. He could go anywhere from there. In Virginia, between the Chesapeake and the Blue Ridge Mountains, it's rather confined. So I must give General Grant some credit that he had much more limited means of maneuver. But thank you for your observations. Oh, and I'm a little fuzzy, but if you ever write your memoirs, I hope you're a little harder on Sherman than you were during your interview just now.
Noted. In the back.
During the discussion about Sherman's march to the sea, comment was made that it was not a history of war. Campaign in the history of war. Could you justify that in light of the fact that during the march to the sea, the warfare was made not so much against the military as against civilians?
Sure. Well, this was aimed at Confederate morale, wasn't it? And he certainly damaged Confederate morale. Didn't he? You can question his means, but I would argue to you that the damage done on that campaign was not quite as great as what it was meant to be. As a matter of fact, you know, they talk about how this was like a 60-mile swath cut through Georgia. And that's not really the case. You know, one historian said it's more like a zipper trail, right? They move and they go out to get food and then they come back, and then they move and they go out to get supplies and they come back, and they always keep moving, right? I think that efficiency and did you attain your goals and did you make a difference are what matter here, right? He set out to cultivate this kind of terrorist reputation, right, as part of his campaign to damage Confederate morale. And if you look at the Confederate papers and you look at the diaries and the journals of people that are involved, it's pretty convincing that he did that to be sure. I mean, when you look at the correspondence among Confederate leaders during that march to the sea, they were desperate to throw something in his way. First, they were desperate to find out where exactly he was going, right? Because Sherman did a really good job feinting in various directions and even hiding his ultimate destination. But I'm not sure that this necessarily places him among history's greatest commanders on its own. but I think Grant thought so. And that's kind of the point of this, right? What was Grant thinking?
You guys condone making warfare against civilians, first, as a means to justify them, and second, as a community to prefer a process. If you're one of those civilians who's in that zipper, it's still a serious problem.
Well, let me put it this way. This war had already gone on for 4 bloody years. The cost was growing ever higher. He wasn't making war directly by killing women and children, though he was stressing their resources, right? Sherman also had come to the conclusion that women, in part, were sustaining the Confederate war effort by shaming their men, you know? And the stress that Sherman put on their families in Georgia caused many to desert the Confederate cause. And so it was very effective. I am in favor of getting this war over just as soon as possible, I think like he was and Grant was. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, my team won. From my standpoint, Derek Maxfield's standpoint, my team won, and I'm glad that they did. You know, I had 6 great-grandfathers that fought in this war. 6.
Union or Confederate?
All wore the blue uniform. All wore the blue uniform. 2 of them never came home. 3 out of 4 gave their lives essentially to end slavery. Not just end the war, but to end slavery. So this is very much part of my outlook.
General Grant, great conversation. I know you worked with a number of esteemed generals in your career, including George, Rock Thomas, as well as Sherman. Could you maybe comment a little bit about your relationship with General Meade?
General Meade.
Yes.
Well, I think that there was a respect, first of all, between the 2 of them. You know, I do think from the correspondence that I have seen that Grant took notice that Meade had kind of been snubbed after Gettysburg. And I think there was a respect for that. Grant was also impressed that Meade did a better job administratively than many of his predecessors had, right? Meade was a reliable man, you know, and Grant really valued that. He was also very loyal, right? But he also recognized in Meade a man that could take orders and keep his head down and not let his ego get in the way, right? And I think that's why he left Meade in place.
Care to comment on the justice of relieving General Warren?
Oh, there's no question there. I think that he got shafted, in my opinion. I'm not a huge fan of Sheridan.
But you gave the order that you could leave.
General Grant did, yes.
Yeah.
But I'm answering Derek Maxfield right now.
Oh, okay.
See, the glasses give way that I'm not in character at the moment. I think he got shafted. I think it was real disservice. I think Sheridan was a hothead. And I think Sheridan already decided he was going to relieve Warren even before this happened. You know what I mean? I think when Sheridan got permission from Grant to relieve Warren, he already decided he was going to do it. I think Warren's fate is sealed right there.
Coming on, agrees to which Grant.
Do you feel lonely?
He was just asking the question. He was. I'm sorry. Coming on, agrees to which Grant was surprised on the first day of trial.
I don't think there's any question that he was surprised and that Sherman was surprised. They shouldn't have been, right? They should not have been. I think Sherman was arrogant, you know. I think Sherman also had a real disdain for one of his commanders, you know, and that was part and parcel of it. But sure, they got surprised. And it was kind of a game in their memoirs to cover their asses, right? That's what memoirs are written for, right? Yeah,
Well, if you're not General Grant, then I don't have to explain Zoom to you.
good.
So we have some questions from Zoom participants. And one of them that seems to have been repeated is, could you comment on the rumors about General Grant's drinking?
Sure. All right, so, obviously what I have to do here is I have to look at all of the evidence, that I've read over the years and come to my own conclusion about it, because there's not really a smoking gun answer here, right? I think Grant did drink. I don't think there's any question about that. I do think he was a spree drinker, as some have suggested. I do wonder, I don't know if you've ever seen Cadwallader's account that was written many, many years later. And I find that one suspicious, not because I'm a fan of Grant, but I find the story just too tall, right? Is there elements of truth in it? Yeah. But I think it's too tall a tale, because if that really happened the way that Cadwallader suggested, word would have gotten out through the entire army about this, right? So I think that is overblown. But the other thing to keep in mind is there were a lot of army rivals that had reason to want to attack Grant on the drinking, just out of rivalry, right?
If I may, I just finished a biography of James H. Wilson, I believe by Edward Stackpole, and he's of the opinion that Wilson is a prime mover in the Grant as a drunkard myth, as because Wilson was pissed off with Grant.
I think there's something to that.
But I think we have to look at the bottom line. The man couldn't have destroyed 3 Confederate armies, gone on to serve 2 terms as president, and had been a habitual drunk. He drank, but it was under control. I think that's the bottom line.
I think it was usually under control. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that Lincoln said was that, Lee couldn't have been defeated until he found a general that could do the grizzly path.
Arithmetic, yeah.
The grizzly arithmetic. And there were, a lot of things in the newspaper calling Grant a butcher and things like that at the time.
Can I get some water? I'm really tired.
And Grant, it's my understanding, he had some kind of event where he fell into bad upset. I think it was at Cold Harbor. Did he ever himself ultimately make a comment, or do you have an opinion about the grizzly man?
Did Grant
Ever make a comment about the amount of Union loss during the Old Age?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I'll tell you how I know that. So my first book, I should advertise this, shouldn't I? My first book.
You have them in the trunk?
No, I don't. You can get them on, Amazon, certainly. But my first book is called Elmira, the Union's most infamous Civil War prison camp, Elmira, New York. And in the process of researching that, I did a lot of work in the War Department records surrounding POWs. And I came across a number of notes between Grant and others, most especially the Adjutant General, I believe. And he was talking about this reputation of this kind of a cold-hearted butcher, right? And what he was saying, there was that there was no way to avoid this. Once the Confederacy had dug in their heels and decided that this was essentially a war of extermination, because they weren't going to settle for anything less than keeping their slaves and their independence also, that it had to end this way, because it was the only way to convince the Confederacy that the war was up. He was sad that the Confederacy did not see the writing on the wall, and in fact kind of blamed them. Because we know a year before the surrender, they could not feed their armies, right? They could not defend their cities. They could not stop Sherman. So all of that loss in the last year could have been avoided if Jefferson Davis especially had just recognized what people, even Lee was telling him, about the way that this all was going to go. And so, yeah, Grant was aware, but he really pinned the blame on them. And I think he's right. I positively think he's right. Jefferson Davis, I don't have a lot of respect for at all, you know. And Lee was a man that had a strong sense of honor and propriety, right? He thought it wasn't his decision to make, right? He was a military man, and his job was, you know, to lead the army, and the political decisions had to be left to the politicians, right? He lead that even to the end, right? Remember, just a couple of days after the surrender, Grant tried to convince Lee to get the other Confederate commanders to lay down their swords, and he refused because he believed that was Jefferson Davis's decision.
Can you comment on the relationship between General Grant and General Thomas? It seems like even in his memoirs, Grant was not a fan of Thomas, despite Thomas's obvious skill.
Well,
Did you move the center for our Zoom?
oh, I'm sorry. I do think that Grant was too hard on Thomas. I do think that Thomas should have received a lot more credit than he did. To some extent, he was eclipsed by Sheridan, right? In the closing days of the war, and the North was so quick to just grab hold of the latest hero, right? And Thomas made it easy. Thomas made it easy because he believed he was a soldier. He should keep his head down and keep quiet, right? And Thomas was really good at just kind of taking his lumps and going his own way, right? We do know that after the war, Thomas felt slighted by Grant's memoir, you know, and Sherman's memoirs. There are a number of people that came to Thomas's defense after Sherman's memoirs were published, right? Yeah, I kind of feel bad about that, and I do think that Grant never gave him his full due. That's a good observation, yeah.
Grant and Lincoln discussed this in terms of surrender prior to the actual surrender. But is there any evidence that Grant afterwards, during Reconstruction, maybe regretted?
I don't think he ever, no, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think that he thought the terms were appropriate. And, you know, remember that there was a time when they wanted to put Lee on trial for treason, you know, and he put a stop to that. In fact, he threatened President Johnson that he would resign publicly if there was any attempt to prosecute Lee. So no, there was never any regrets there.
Over here.
Yes, sir.
So how often would you give an interview to a reporter? Did you have a favorite reporter?
I think Cadwalader was one of his favorites. You know, he wasn't a man that turned people away generally. You know, Grant was quiet. He was generally good-natured. You know, I think one of the things I try to portray here is it's been a long day and he's tired. He's getting a little irritated. You know. Because, you know, he just doesn't want to be doing this, but he's too polite, you know, to turn this young man away. I think that's just kind of how Grant was, you know. He was very open with reporters. You know, his staff was basically told, let them have to run the camp. You know?
Good question for the correspondent.
Finally.
Why didn't you ask him if he was going to run for president?
Oh, see,
because the author didn't write it that way.
I mean, that would be kind of obvious, right? Lincoln's the second term. Who does to follow Lincoln?
Right.
Can I answer this?
No, I want to be the correspondent.
Then you can answer.
Well,
Yeah.
it's actually a more interesting narrative because what happens in Townsend's life follows what happens to Lincoln instead. Because Townsend ends up making his career out of Lincoln's assassination. He publishes a book out of his reports following the trial of John Wilkes Booth. And, you know, that sort of skyrockets him into this sort of figure in journalism history. So, I mean, that's sort of where it would go if it were to go somewhere else, I think.
I had something, when I wrote this, I had something on my mind, as writers often do. And I wanted to demonstrate how the hero of the moment was what the press often would focus on, right? So you'll notice he kept coming back to Sherman. He kept coming back to Sherman, and he kept coming back to Sherman, you know? And that is because Sherman was still the boy of the moment. And in fact, I think there was more talk at that moment of Sherman running for president than there was Grant running for president.
When did Grant first become political and decided to run for president? Was he right after Lincoln's assassination?
Certainly wasn't during the war. I think that he was used as a pawn in the days after the war. You know, he was used as this pawn between Johnson and Stanton to a large extent, right? And, you know, Grant is a nice enough fella, you know, but he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, you know? He doesn't have a lot of political experience. And he's also a little naive politically, you know, and he probably recognized he was being used to some extent, you know, but I think that, you know, the people around him, people he respected, were pushing him into the presidency, and the path of least resistance was just to follow.
Julia pushed it.
I think Julia had some role in it, yes.
Certainly the second and possibly the third time he was in the war.
Yeah.
What do you think about the idea he just saw how bad a job Andrew Johnson was doing? And he thought, I can do better than that.
See, I don't know if Grant would have thought that way though.
Wasn't at the end of the Civil War, wasn't Grant more of a popular and more of a famous person, I guess, than Lincoln? I mean, didn't he get more adulation from the public than even Lincoln did at the end of the Civil War?
Well, yes. I mean, let's remember that Lincoln was never popular, especially in Washington. You know, I mean, they made terrible comments around, you know, behind his back, sometimes to his face. You know, it wouldn't have been hard to eclipse Lincoln's popularity. You know, he had strength among the ordinary people of the country, you know, but politicians didn't respect him, you know.
Did Grant ever carve anything? Did he ever whittle?
Oh, he whittled. He was a famous whittler. He never carved a thing. It was just mindless, just kind of mindless whittling, you know, just to do something. You know, there was a certain restlessness.
Mentioned that deluge of dispatches after the first day at Shiloh. Misbegotten reports, rumors, ill sorts reports. And this could go through both of them. Could you cite, I mean, by name, correspondence and journals or newspapers? I mean, just a couple of examples
Okay,
in
so
your time that were consistently unreliable or consistently misspoke the truth as far as their reporting.
I can't name a correspondent off the top of my head, but I can tell you that there was a Chicago paper, I think the Tribune, and several Ohio papers that were surprisingly hard on Grant, especially early in the war, you know, continually hammering that he was a drunkard. I do know that the congressman from Illinois, McClernand, a number of the organs that he was close to in Illinois were very harsh on Grant, but that was politically motivated. So those are a few.
I didn't, Townsend's off the hook here for early in the war, he was in Europe doing a lecture series. So Townsend wasn't, you know, part of that circuit at all.
How about some of your journalistic colleagues? Were there any-
Not off the top of my head, no.
Grant and Mark Twain's relationship, you know, how did Grant and Mark Twain's relationship start?
Well, so Twain met Grant during the war in Washington on at least one occasion. I don't know how much they kept in touch. Obviously, after the war, while Grant was president, they met on a couple of occasions. And then, of course, he became important in publishing Grant's memoirs later on. I think that not only did Twain desperately want the money and the profits from publishing those memoirs, but I do think he had an authentic kind of humanitarian angle on it too, that he knew that Grant could do better than the offer that was made to him, you know. That's the best I can do on that one.
Twain lived and wrote in Elmira. Did he ever comment on the prisoner of war situation?
So most of his experience in Elmira is after the war.
Yes.
You know, he visited the Langdons once or twice before the war was over, but most of his time in Elmira was after the war, you know. He did meet John Jones on at least one occasion. John Jones was the caretaker of the Woodlawn Cemetery in Elmira. Jones was a well-known conductor on the Underground Railroad and escaped slave himself. So I know that happened. I don't know what was said, you know. There's by way of advertisement, there is a appendix of my book, Elmira, that focuses on John Jones. And there's another appendix that talks about Mark Twain and Elmira. One I wrote, so it's pretty good. The other was very good, about how Elmira played a role in making Mark Twain who he was. So that colleague of mine wrote that. I highly recommend it.
Was Mike was from?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, Twain was buried in Elmira.
Didn't Twain see an article that Grant was writing his memoirs, but in chapter form, and gave it to a magazine, and Twain saw it there and thought he could do a better job?
I think so. So.
How people think much more hard on Grant? Do they clustered it around a certain geographic area?
The Midwest generally, yeah. Which is kind of ironic, right? Because Grant is, you know, from Ohio and Illinois.
Yeah.
But it was very political. Yeah. A lot of the most ambitious generals came from the Midwest.
For sure.
And then some of the governors of the Midwestern states, you know, Democrats or, you know, politically motivated.
How did Grant himself get an appointment to West Point? What was the political congressional connection there? Family?
His father really wanted it. And his father had just enough political pull to pull it off. I think that his father, Jesse, was very kind of socially ambitious. And I think that he knew that if he had a son that went to West Point, that would help his own social status and perhaps political future. Yeah.
You know, the congressman that recommended it? Oh, it was in Illinois, it was an Ohio congressman.
Yeah. Would it have been L.U. Washburn? Yeah, I don't know. I don't recall. I probably did know that at one time. By way of advertisement, I have a new book coming out this summer that I'm very excited about. It's a biography of William Tecumseh Sherman. I've been working on this for probably 15 years. It's called Man of Fire, William Tecumseh Sherman in the Civil War. I'm told it will be out in July or early August. So I appreciate it if you keep your eye open for that. That's kind of a labor of love for me. I think you'll be interested in some of my conclusions. Maybe I can revisit science books.
Besides this visit, did Grant ever historically come to Cleveland?
Oh, sure.
How many times did you say?
Oh, boy, I don't know, but both Sherman and Grant crisscrossed Ohio during the war. You know, they had a number of high-profile meetings at the end of the war in Cincinnati. They were really important. And of course, Sherman is from Lancaster. Yes.
It's been so interesting, and especially in the Q&A
Thank you.
that we've been going at. I don't think we know a lot about your background.
Oh, all right. So I'm a professor of history at Genesee Community College in Batavia, New York. I've been at GCC for almost 12 years now. Let's see. I got my bachelor's degree at SUNY Portland, my MA at Villanova University, did my doctoral work at the University of Buffalo. I'm newly married.
I'm a graduate student at the University of Buffalo, also studying history. Hold on a minute. And a librarian, certified librarian, working at GCC as well.
Huzzah!
Goodness.
You mentioned that your involvement in the Civil War comes back to so many great-great-grandfathers who were members of the Union forces. Is that how you've always been involved with interest in the Civil War?
I think I've been interested in the Civil War for most of my life. I remember when I was growing up, you know, 7 or 8 years old, I kept borrowing this one volume from a great uncle. It was the National Geographic Civil War volume, you know, and I borrowed it over and over and over again, you know. And so I think my interest went back to that book in particular when I was quite young. And then, you know, just kind of grew slowly.
Did family talk about it a lot?
No, they didn't. As a matter of fact, they were, there was almost nothing. Though I had my father's mother. She said, well, he was a Confederate. He died in Virginia. You know, here's his picture. And I thought, better. That whole family is from Potsdam, New York, up near the Canadian border. This didn't make sense to me, you know. I kept remembering, you know, I kept studying the picture thinking, why would a man from the Potsdam Canton area become a Confederate, right? And years later, I finally got a hold of his records and I discovered that she had misunderstood. And he had kind of a common name, Thomas Birch was his name, you know, so it took me a while to nail it down, right? But her misunderstanding was because he fought in Virginia during the Wilderness Campaign, during the Overland Campaign, and he was wounded in the foot. He had his foot amputated in a Virginia hospital, but then died of the measles in Alexandria. And she somehow came to the conclusion that because he fought and died in Virginia, that he was Confederate. But from what he was wearing, you couldn't really tell in the photo. You know? So that's one anecdote I have.
Grant, was he a slaveholder by way of his wife's working?
I think there was one or two that came through the dents, yes, but it was not an institution that he ever thought much of, and did what he could to not be associated with it. But the dents,
Part of their household at any time?
Household slaves.
He had one.
yeah.
How long did that happen?
It wasn't for long. It was during the days of, during his hard scrabble days out in St. Louis, and it was mostly the Dents influence. He had this rocky relationship with Julia's father, but he doesn't have an extensive history with slavery.
That's pretty well pointed out if you visit the Grant home in St. Louis.
Whitehaven?
Whitehaven, you see the tabloids. over
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Pretty well distinguished out there.
Julia had a long history. And in fact, you were studying Julia.
Yes.
Did you come across an interesting history with her?
Yes, she had a enslaved caretaker who she was very close to, Black Julia. She had the same name. And she was convinced in her memoirs that Black Julia loved her, and could not understand why she wanted to leave, as soon as she was emancipated. She was like, why are you leaving? Don't you want to stay with the family? It's just boggled her mind.
Yes, sir.
Previously, you were talking about, you were naming a series of generals, one of which you named was Logan, L-O-G-A-N.
Yeah.
Was that General Logan, was he from Painesville, Ohio?
He's from Illinois, I thought. So Blackjack was a politician general. He wasn't a West Pointer.
The reason I'm asking the question is there is a General Logan that came from Ashtabula, Ohio, that later after the war was a leader of the Grand Army of the Republic.
Well, I know Blackjack was a leader of the Grand Army of the Republic for a while.
And this General Logan wrote the introduction and for the Veterans of Foreign Wars for the Memorial Day ceremony for Decoration Day. Okay.
Yeah. I just don't know enough about Logan to be able to.
I don't either.
Yeah.
He's one of my
I do know-
ancestors.
Yeah,
That's why I'm asking the question.
Oh, I see. Okay, that makes sense. I do know that Logan and Sherman did not have a good relationship after the war at all. It was quite a contentious relationship.
I was just looking,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you more.
I don't have a relationship, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even know how I go about finding it.
Well, start with the biographies and then go through the footnotes. That's what I
John
would-
A. Logan was born in Murfreesboro, Illinois, 1826.
Okay. Google. Good old Google.
Are there any other questions for General Grant?
Thank you.
Thank you.